It's almost always a good idea to let people know you have a good sense of humor, because in this society, we take humor very seriously. And by the way, you do have a good sense of humor, don't you? I'm confident you'll answer in the affirmative, because virtually everyone is sure they have a good sense of humor, and we'll be talking more about that later. Right now, I just want to emphasize how important humor is as an aspect of strong character. Yet, if you were to ask 100 people to name character's most vital elements, I doubt if more than 5 would refer to humor. In fact, I don't think any would. When he wrote his classic study of American society in the early 18th century, the Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, predicted that if the United States ever came to be ruled by a dictator, it would be someone with a well-developed sense of humor. If this is true, it's certainly a very different situation than you would find in any other country in the world. Think of the communist and fascist dictators who have played such a major role in 20th century history. They were not exactly a bunch of laugh-a-minute guys. They were good at projecting anger, and they were good at creating fear, but humor? No. Americans, however, respond to very different qualities in their leaders. And though they were obviously not dictators or tyrants, it's true that most of our beloved national leaders have had the ability to make others laugh and to laugh at themselves. Though he was fundamentally a rather melancholy man, Abraham Lincoln was also renowned as a humorist. Every biography of Lincoln refers to his love of funny stories and his willingness to stop and tell a joke even in the midst of important business. And in more recent times, Presidents Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan were able to smooth out the ups and downs of their political careers with humor, and it was often directed at themselves. People could see that these men were strong enough and confident enough to make jokes at their own expense. And as we'll discuss later, these men were also wise enough to apply humor carefully and at the right times. When we recognize those abilities in a person, we're able to believe they'll also be strong and confident in serious or even dangerous situations. In short, we as Americans see a well-developed sense of humor as an aspect of a strong character and as almost a prerequisite for leadership. But before you go out and buy a joke book as part of your personal self-development program, here's the bad news. To a great extent, you can't learn to be humorous, and that alone makes humor different from every other trait we've discussed in this program. There are many examples of people who learned to overcome fear or even downright cowardice, and who went on to become courageous leaders. There are fools who learned to be wise, and there are liars who turned into honest men and women. There are rigid thinkers who learned flexibility, but I personally have never encountered a humorless person who learned to be humorous. And if there were such a person, I'm sure I would have come across one by now, because I have certainly encountered a great many humorless people. Perhaps one reason we respond so strongly to humor in our leaders is because we associate it with honesty. And I think this association is well-founded. Real humor is honest because real humor can't be faked. You can pretend to be serious, just like you can pretend to be intelligent. You can always fake those qualities, and some people do it all the time, but you can't really pretend to be funny. The real irony, however, is that nobody feels like they have to pretend to fake having a good sense of humor, because everybody thinks that they actually have one. People will admit to almost anything before they confess to being humorless. Have you ever met anyone who said, I just don't know how to laugh. I just don't like it when things are funny, and I'm just much more comfortable being serious all the time. I've never met anyone like that, and I am very confident that I never will. In fact, If somebody actually confessed to me that he didn't have any sense of humor, I would think he must be joking. Take, for instance, a fellow named Sam. Sam was about as dour an individual as you would ever want to meet. He was in the meatpacking industry, which isn't an especially amusing occupation to begin with, and in his spare time, he was always trying to discover ways to make a quick $1 million. He had really been influenced by the hula hoop fad that swept the country during the summer of 1958. For some reason, that summer, all the kids in America decided they had to have hula hoops. And the company that manufactured them made a huge amount of money. Sam was captivated by this phenomenon. It really fired his imagination. Although he made very good money with his meatpacking business, he was determined to recreate the hula hoop. And he spent thousands of dollars trying to develop or find new toys. Some of them were very clever, but you had to be careful with them. There was one contraption that involved a block of wood on a string. I'm not sure how it was supposed to work, but if a kid wasn't careful and swung it around a little too fast, anybody standing nearby would be knocked cold. In any case, there was something very funny about seeing this totally humorless man, Sam, who was already quite wealthy, trying to make millions with silly toys. But after a while, there was also something a little sad about it, because there really was only one hula hoop fad, and Sam was clearly not going to recreate it. One day, a coworker of Sam's finally decided to have a talk with him. This coworker was quite a bit younger, so he approached Sam very deferentially, saying, "Sam, I'm a little confused. You're interested in making a lot of money on a new toy, but you're actually losing a lot of money trying to develop them or importing them from South America. Can you tell me a little bit about what you think is going on here?" Well, Sam just looked at him and sighed. He said, "This business we're in is a pretty grim way of making money. I've got to have something going on the side. I've got to have something to keep my mind off making sausages and hamburger." To which the coworker replied, "Sam, I can certainly understand that, and I sympathize with how you feel, but you just don't seem to have a real knack for the toy business. Why don't you get involved with something that you're good at? Something that would let you use your natural abilities?" He was silent for a moment, thinking it over. When he concentrated like that, his chin sank down against his chest, and he looked like an old hound dog. He really seemed to have the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. He looked like he'd just lost his best friend in the world. Finally, he looked up and said, "Well, I've always had an excellent sense of humor. Maybe I could do something with that." Since that conversation, Sam has been trying his hand at writing scripts for television comedies. Wouldn't it be interesting and disturbing if one of them were set in a slaughterhouse? You see, a man or woman will admit to anything before they admit to being a sourpuss. It just doesn't happen. But it's not like they secretly know they're humorless and are trying to keep it to themselves. It's not like they secretly know they have this great weakness, which is not having a sense of humor. That's not the way it is at all. No, every gloomy Gus really thinks he's a very funny guy. Sam the meatpacker was a perfect example of that. Like everybody else, he thought he had a very good sense of humor, and he even thought he might be able to cash in on it somehow. That's one of the reasons that humor is such a mysterious and elusive quality. We've all seen gangster movies where the head of the mob makes some terrible joke, and all the guys sitting around the table have to keep laughing until he lets them know it's safe to stop. That doesn't just happen among gangsters. That happens every day in the corporate boardrooms and congressional offices. It even happens around family dinner tables. Since everybody deeply believes that they have a good sense of humor, how can you find out if you actually don't? Unfortunately, you probably can't. It's just a very tough situation to deal with. Even your best friends won't tell you you're a humorless wet blanket. Fortunately, I'm not. I wake up every day feeling thankful for my good sense of humor, and in that sense, I'm sure I'm just like everybody else. We spoke a moment ago about the lack of humor that has characterized dictators throughout history. That's because real humor is almost always subversive. Humor undermines dictatorial power. It punctures balloons. It knocks people off pedestals. Nothing enraged Adolf Hitler more than Charlie Chaplin's portrayal of him in the movie called The Great Dictator. Chaplin, who was actually born on the same day as Hitler, did a fantastic job of capturing the dictator's every nuance and mannerism. This movie did more to alert the American people to the real nature of the Nazi dictatorship than any book or news report available at the time. Powerful people and the symbols of power that they like to accumulate are rarely humorous, at least intentionally. Think of those old Russian generals with all those rows of ribbons on their uniforms. Whatever else you might want to say about them, it was obvious that those uniforms were supposed to be very serious. A dozen rows of ribbons, a big red star on the hat, all sorts of gold braid hanging everywhere. Hey, this is no laughing matter. What a wonderful irony, then, that humor played an important part in the downfall of the Soviet Union. In the final years of the communist regime, political jokes became a highly developed art form in Russia and in all the countries of Eastern Europe. And the generals didn't get the joke until it was too late. The anti-government jokes that were circulating in the Soviet Union during its final years were an example of a particular kind of humor. They were designed to elicit a very specific response, which we can call the laughter of ridicule. This is really a form of hostility disguised as mirth. It's intended to be very destructive to its target, and at the same time it serves as a kind of survival mechanism for the joke teller and his listener. It allows them to express their anger indirectly. If you're ever in a leadership position and you find that this kind of hostile humor has been directed at you, I strongly suggest that you do one thing immediately. And I'm not going to suggest that you take action to suppress the jokes. Instead, you had better ask yourself what you've been doing to provoke this kind of response among your subordinates. And once you figure it out, I suggest that you change that behavior immediately. Laughter of ridicule is a very bad sign for a leader. It's one kind of humor that should be taken very seriously. There are several other categories of laughter that we should consider as well. Have you ever gone to a comedy movie and noticed that the audience starts laughing even before anything funny happens? A leading comic actor can simply come on the screen and make a bland remark about the weather, and everyone in the audience will start laughing. I've seen this happen many times with people like Robin Williams and Steve Martin. Underlying this kind of laughter is a desire on the part of people to have a shared experience. They want to participate in the experience together. I call this the laughter of community. Another kind of laughter that can be observed at the movies is something I call laughter of recognition. This occurs when someone wants to show that they get the joke. They see how something was intended to be funny, even if less informed people don't see it. This kind of laughter is especially common among younger audiences, and many members of the older generation find themselves frequently missing out on it. Irony is the basis for so much humor today. And by its very nature, irony is intended to exclude a certain percentage of people. The rest of them laugh to show that they've been admitted to the club. They laugh to show they recognize the joke, and therefore deserve to be recognized as members of that select group. That's why I call it laughter of recognition. Polite laughter is yet another category. This is sort of a social non-laughter that one gets when a laughing response is called for, but isn't really motivated. We've all had the experience of telling a joke that doesn't really go over too well and elicits only polite laughter. And we've all responded to such jokes with polite laughter of our own. It's just a gesture that keeps the ball rolling, but it's an important one. Nobody likes to be on the receiving end of polite laughter, but it's better than being poked in the eye with a sharp stick, to quote an old joke. The last and most important category of laughter I'll mention might be called real laughter. It's spontaneous, it's happy, it's unpremeditated, it has no hidden agenda. It happens when you see or hear something that's really funny. I'd like to spend a moment talking about this category of real laughter because it's one of the most important aspects of humor. The more real laughter you can bring into your life, the better off you'll be. I've spoken quite a bit about children and the raising of children in this program, and kids are really our best source of knowledge about real laughter. They really put their whole selves into it. We lose that to a large extent as we get older, and I'm not sure that loss can be completely avoided. For example, think about someone, one of your own kids, a neighbor or a niece or nephew that you've watched grow up. Whatever interest this person pursues today, it's likely that he or she was a budding artist in the early years. Crayons, markers, and pads of paper are standard issue in most households with young kids, and those kids draw big, beautiful pictures with all sorts of colors and patterns. At that age, there are no rules about keeping inside the lines and using certain colors for certain objects. Those pictures that grace refrigerators across the country are examples of artistic genius. Then when kids grow to about 5 or 6 years old, their drawings change. They begin drawing stick figures standing next to houses that consist of a triangle on top of a square. Kids this age are still just as proud of their drawings and actually see them as a big advance over the ones they'd done as babies. And they are more advanced in some ways, but they're also less free. There's a sense of responsibility about them, an effort to put everything in the right place and make everything the right color and the right size. In addition, around the same time as these kids' drawings change, their laughter changes too. It's still delightful, but there's more awareness in it. I guess that's just the way it's got to be. As the British poet William Wordsworth put it, though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass and glory in the flower, we will grieve not, but rather find strength in what remains behind. I'm sure kids have a lot of concerns and worries that seem as big to them as ours do to us, but they really don't have a lot of responsibilities. They really don't have bills that have to be paid by tomorrow, or presentations or phone calls that can make your palms sweat. It's those kinds of responsibilities that suppress real laughter as we get older. And there's simply no avoiding it. But we should try to bring real laughter into our lives as much as we possibly can. It's good for the soul. And there's even been evidence that heartfelt laughter has the ability to benefit physical health. Let me say a few practical things about the role of humor in leadership, particularly in business or management situations. Have you ever noticed how certain jokes seem to suddenly appear in the business community, circulate for a while, and then they gradually disappear? Where do these jokes come from? How do they get started? You'll hear them at the start of meetings or conferences when everybody is trying to get settled down. During the course of 1 week, you can have meetings in Los Angeles, Phoenix, Indianapolis, and Boston, and hear the same joke in every one of those meetings. There's something almost eerie about it. In any case, these business meeting jokes really have some important functions. First, they're sort of a bonding ritual, where everybody shows that they share a sense of humor and that they like to laugh about the same things. I think that function is pretty obvious. But there's another function of jokes that's more subtle but extremely important. In a way, they're intended to rid the situation of humor. Once the joke has been told, the humor has been encapsulated or compartmentalized within that joke, and it won't be seen again until the meeting is over. That's why it's good to begin a very serious discussion with a joke after the moment of humor has been experienced through the joke. Seriousness can reign for the balance of the meeting. I've seen this phenomenon take place many times. If you handle it correctly then, telling a joke can really reinforce your image as a serious person. Once the joke is out of the way, you can be as intense as you want for as long as you want, because all humor has been compressed into the joke, and now the joke is over and done with. There's an important distinction to be made between the leader who tells jokes and a very different kind of person who I'll call the funny guy. And let me point out very quickly that the funny guy is almost always a guy. I don't believe I've ever come across a woman in business who fills this role. I'm not sure why that's true. In any case, the funny guy is someone who doesn't seem to understand that the role of jokes is to reinforce the seriousness of the rest of the interaction. He doesn't understand that a joke is really a kind of scapegoat that forms the center of a little ceremony for a moment and then is banished once and for all. No, the funny guy is someone who keeps telling jokes, who keeps reintroducing humor into a situation from which everyone else has tried to banish it. I can honestly say that I've never met an effective leader whom I would identify as a funny guy. And it's even worse for the funny guy if he actually is funny. Then he's just a clown, and clowns simply are not given leadership positions in any organization. The leaders I spoke of earlier, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Reagan, used jokes and witticisms to demonstrate their humanity and to diffuse hostility, but they were by no means funny guys. Often their jokes and quips weren't even really funny. They were symbols of humor rather than real examples of it. And even this largely symbolic version of humor was applied very carefully. If it had been otherwise, these men would never have achieved a leadership role of any kind, let alone that of President of the United States. Most funny guys didn't start out that way. They're generally people who have been passed over several times and are using humor to help them cope with their disappointment. And there's also an element of anger in most funny guys, though it's usually deeply hidden, and they may not even be consciously aware of it. By continuing to be funny in situations where it's no longer appropriate, the funny guy may unconsciously be trying to subvert the goals of the group. Effective leaders recognize this, and they see to it that funny guys are denied any real responsibility. Once again, and as with the other qualities we've discussed in this program, there's something paradoxical in our attitude toward humor. We want to discover humor in other people, and we want to find it in ourselves, but we don't want too much of it. And in certain situations, we don't want any of it at all. Leaders intuitively understand the role of humor, and they apply it in the right amounts at the right times. They understand that, as with many of the other good things in life, too much of a good thing is almost as bad as none at all. Earlier I suggested that to a large extent humor is something that you either have or you don't. That unlike many other self-development skills, it's very difficult to improve your capacity for humor. But if that's true, doesn't it suggest that there's something self-contradictory about this whole discussion? After all, what's the point of talking so much about humor if there's really very little you can do towards strengthening your capacity for it? Well, it may be true that you can't increase the natural proportion of humor in your personality beyond a certain preordained point. But that's not the end of the story. You can still learn to have a basically humorous approach to life. or perhaps playful would be a better word. And I think the ability to do so is an extremely important indicator of strong character. Modern physics has demonstrated that light can act as either a particle or a wave. If we design an experiment based on light behaving like a wave, we will find that it does indeed behave like a wave. If we design another experiment in which light is supposed to behave like a particle, it sure enough behaves like a particle. So what really is the true nature of light? There is no simple answer to that question. It's all a matter of perception and expectation. In the same way, life can be either a comedy or a tragedy, and it's always in your power to determine how you want to see it. I prefer to see it as a comedy, and I highly recommend this to you also, but let me explain exactly what I mean by that. I don't mean to suggest that life is a comedy like you see on television at 8 o'clock on Channel 5. I'm using comedy according to the classical definition of the term, as a progression from sadness to happiness, from a low point to a high point, from poverty to wealth in every sense. In literature, the best example of comedy in this sense is Dante's Divine Comedy. Although I don't believe there is a single joke in that entire work, it's a comedy in the sense that the story begins in hell and ends in paradise. Yet most people don't even know that Dante wrote 2 more volumes that take place after the completion of the Inferno. History has chosen to focus on the frightening, painful part of Dante's poem, and if you're not careful, you may find yourself doing the same thing in your own life. We live in a time that has equated seriousness with intelligence, unhappiness with sensitivity, and victimization with moral authority. In short, we have largely chosen to see life as tragic rather than comic. But to the extent you participate in this, I believe you are limiting your potential for success in the material sense, and, even more importantly, you are doing nothing for your character, or at least nothing good. Humor can be your best tool for distancing yourself from the negativity and pessimism that's so rampant today. It's not always an easy tool to use, but I believe its importance has been seriously underestimated as an element of strong character. George Bernard Shaw said that everything is funny as long as it happens to someone else. But a really strong person is able to laugh even when the joke's on him. Just as light will conform to various kinds of experiments, if you choose to find humor in life and in your own circumstances, you will find it. If you're of strong enough character to see life as a comedy, in the sense I've described, you are strong enough to make it really be that way as well. And I'm very serious about that.